Good morning, good afternoon, good day, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. So, for your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of 1-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting guests, like most of you out there, about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and whatever it is we have decided to talk about. Now, I'm kind of fumbling along here because my allergies are acting up, and if I suddenly sneeze, you know I'm not allergic to our guest. Dr. Randy Blazak. Did I pronounce that properly?
Yeah, that's right, Blazak.
He's a professor at Portland State University, and we'll talk more about what he's about in his own words. As you know, the show goes in two major segments. The first half is what I call the bio segment, Who Are You? So that my viewers can get an idea who you are when we hear what you're talking about.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
I'm ready. I'm ready. I don't know if they can handle it, but I'll be as honest as I can be.
What a rich, rich voice. Have you done any theater, any acting?
You know, in 7th grade, I was the star of Mr. Grumpy's Toy Shop. I was Mr. Grumpy. And that was the peak of my acting career.
Very good.
Once you've been the star on stage at Woodridge Elementary, there's really nothing but going down from that, so I quit right there.
Yeah. So how are you feeling right now?
I'm good. I'm good. You know, the summertime is often interesting for us criminologists because the summer usually brings an increase in the crime rate, so we're a little bit more on our toes as people are relaxing. When you're a criminologist, you sort of know that summertime means things are going to pick up a little bit. So I both enjoy it and kind of have a little trepidation about summer. But the good news is Portland, you know, has a really low crime rate compared to most cities. So I'm originally from Atlanta, where summer is often sort of a treacherous time.
What's a criminologist?
Well, that's a good question. You know, a criminologist, it's sort of a multidisciplinary field. So some folks come from kind of administrative studies. Some people are psychologists. I'm a sociologist, and looking at the causes and the responses to crime.
Yes.
So trying to understand why people do commit crime and then what to do with them once they do. So criminologists are often, you know, out in the streets or interviewing people who are juvenile delinquents or offenders, but they're also helping develop policy. A lot of the war on poverty in the 1960s, a lot of those policies that came out of the Johnson administration came from criminological research, you know, doing sort of hard science about what are the core causes of crime. And that's a little bit of what I do. My area is focuses on hate crimes in prisons, so it's never boring.
Hate crimes in prisons?
Hate crimes and prisons.
prisons.
Yeah, because, you know, these folks end up, and we may get into this, many of them end up in prisons, and then we have a problem in prisons, and then they come out of prisons, and we have even a bigger problem. So trying to figure out how those two issues fit together has been the work that I've been doing for about the last 5 years.
How did you get interested in that kind of work?
Well,
it's funny.
Well, this is the bio part, I guess. I grew up in a town in Georgia called Stone Mountain that is kind of famous. There's a big rock that sticks out of the ground.
Yeah.
That's the name of the town.
Yes, I've been there.
Largest exposed piece of granite on Earth. And it's mentioned in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. There's a part where he says, let the freedom ring from the hills of Mississippi and from Stone Mountain in Georgia. And that was my town. And I always thought that was great that my town got mentioned in that famous speech. But the reason Dr. King mentioned it is because it's the birthplace of the 20th century Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
1916. And I grew up around the Klan. I grew up thinking that every town had a Klan. They all marched on Labor Day, and I had friends whose fathers were in the Klan. And then I went off to college and found out that that wasn't true.
You didn't become a Klansman?
No, one of my best friends, though, growing up was a Klansman for a long time.
Really?
He was the exalted Cyclops of the Southern Knights of the KKK. And he helped me sort of enter that world when I was a graduate student to study it, because I wanted to really understand. It's very easy to sit back in judgment and think about, you know, they're inbred hillbillies, or they're crazy, or they're drinking too much moonshine, or, you know, whatever the explanation is. But I wanted to walk a mile in their shoes because I knew some of those folks, and I knew very easily I could have been in that same same sheet, as it were. so that's kind of where my interest in this topic started.
Why didn't you follow that direction instead of the direction you did?
That's a good question. I think part of it was sort of two parts. One is the music that I liked had its roots in black music. You know, you couldn't like the Beatles without liking the Motown music that they were imitating, or you couldn't like the punk rock I was listening to without liking Bob Marley and the Wailers. So part of it was it didn't really sit well with me, even though I was hearing it a lot and kind of sometimes mimicking the things I was saying. But then it was really, I think, going off to college. I think if I hadn't sat in a sociology class and had that world explained to me, and that it's not I wasn't seeing race, I was seeing class, and you know that people are the products of their environment, and somebody who grows up in inner city Atlanta is going to have a different life than somebody who grows up in rural Georgia, and really starting to put those pieces together. And it was almost like a light bulb came on above my head, and I thought, wow, I've really been going down the wrong road. And I thought I had an opportunity to use my whiteness to explore that world and maybe help other people from going down that road. So as a graduate student, I was at Emory University in Atlanta. You know, I had to make a decision about what my research topic was going to be, and I had a whole bunch of interests. It was the 1980s, but there was a time when a kind of new group was on the scene. The racist skinheads showed up on the scene and were kind of doing some violence. They were in Atlanta, they were in Portland, as many people know, and I thought, well, here's my opportunity. And this is a group that isn't a rural, old-fashioned white supremacist group. This is kind of a hip, new, violent white supremacist group, and it's essentially right on my doorstep. Yeah, and so I used to, you know, it was the 1980s, so we were sort of protesting whatever Ronald Reagan was doing that week, and yeah, so there was a lot of protesting going on, right? And so often the skinheads would show up to attack the protesters, and so I was one of those people that was attacked. I had a Vespa scooter that they stole and set on fire, and they were often telling me they were going to get me. And so I thought, well, I'll get you back. I'm going to study you for the rest of my life, and that'll teach you a lesson. But in doing so, the goal was not only to understand why this thing was happening in the late 80s and then into the 90s and then into the 21st century, but also to develop strategies to get people out of the movement. Because they're victims too. I mean, a lot of the folks who are part of that world are like my friend from elementary school who became a Klan member. You know, now he's completely out of it. He's married to an African-American woman and I have a beautiful kid. Yeah, I know. It sounds like a Disney movie or something. Like he just fell in love. But often that's the way out. I mean, there's often these wonderful stories about people who leave the movement and become sort of the exact opposite. I mean, some of the most violent skinheads and some of the people who are associated with heinous hate crimes are now doing anti-racism work because they were victims too. So walk a mile in their shoes. That was sort of the idea of this. And when I started this in the late 80s, 1987 I think I started, I would never have guessed that in 2012 I still would be talking about these guys. And so unfortunately, you know, we're still dealing with these groups. We haven't come as far as we hoped, but history doesn't move in a straight line. You know, we go 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, you've chosen to pursue this line of study and learning and work. And it's a result of your learning, but it seems to me from where you come from, and there must be something in your genetic makeup that has you leaning in this direction. Did you get this from your mom and dad, this search for concern about justice and decency and loving your fellow human being?
Gosh.
This is the bio stuff I'm probing.
Right, yeah.
If I ask you a question you don't want to answer, you don't have to
Well,
answer.
you know, my parents were sort of normal middle-class white folk who were never overtly racist, but picked up on a lot of the subtle racism in their environment. So, for example, the story was when I was a kid from my dad, who didn't mean it maliciously, if a black family moves into your neighborhood, the property values are going to go down.
Yeah.
Right? That's what he would hear, which is totally untrue and manufactured largely by the real estate industry who profited from it. But he would sort of repeat that stuff. Or when we drove into Atlanta, my mother would say, lock the car doors, they'll get you.
Sure.
And so I grew up picking up on that very subtle racism from them, some of that I got from them, but also from them I got this sense of fairness and trying to find what the real answer is. But I have to say, a lot of it, I mean, it's a very good question, because I really don't know what the motivation. I mean, part of it, I think, is a little bit of guilt, because as a 16-year-old, I bought into a lot of that ideology. I had a journalism class, and we had to write an editorial, and my editorial was, of all the things I could have written about, I wrote, if we have Black History Month, why can't we have White History Month? That was my topic.
Sure.
And of course, the teacher should have said, Randy, go get the history book, open it up to every page. Every month is White History Month. But I was sort of allowed to kind of follow that path, because it was sort of very subtly supported. You know, we would make fun of the Klan, but the idea was that the Klan was sort of there to protect us or defend our territory. And you know, when I went to college and started to learn about things like racism, I did feel this intense sense of guilt that I spent, you know, a certain small part of my life buying into that. And so I think that became the thing that motivated me. It's a really good question. I wish I had a really good answer, like my dad took me to Martin Luther King's tomb.
You have a really good answer, as I'm hearing it.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm trying. Yeah, but that, I mean, it's that sense, and I still cringe when I think of some of the things that I thought. But I had, you know, I was raised to be afraid of Black people. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a very white supremacist environment.
So was I.
Well,
I'm a Creole from New Orleans.
Oh,
you know,
so
like,
yeah.
You know, Black people and white people are dangerous.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, and it was, and I knew very little of people that weren't like me. I didn't know any Jewish people. I didn't know any Muslim people or Asian people, for that matter. And so I just had these stereotypes. You know, my favorite show, and some of your viewers might remember the show when I was a kid, was Starsky and Hutch. And there was a Black character on that show, Huggy Bear, and he was a pimp.
Yeah.
And so that was my window into Black culture, right? Good times, Black equal poor, you know. I mean, in the 70s, basically, those were the images you got of Black people on TV.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the stuff that I swallowed. And and then it became very exciting to tear that down. You know, especially as the 70s became the 80s, and we started to become more multicultural, and hip hop music came onto the scene, and I started, you know, realizing that all the music that I loved had Black roots. So going down that road and listening to old Lead Belly records, you know, if I'm going to like Led Zeppelin, they're playing Lead Belly records. So I need to listen to these old blues records. And so once I tried to move away from the racism, this whole world opened up to me of all the stuff that was okay to dive into. Because, you know, in this deep South especially, and I think this still happens, if you're a white person who likes Black music or Black people, you're going to be chastised. And there's a word for it, and it starts with N and ends with lover, mm-hmm. right? And
yes.
So there is a certain stigma, but once I got out of Stone Mountain and got to college, I could listen to all that, I could explore it, and also give myself a certain amount of permission to make mistakes. You know, sometimes you don't know what's appropriate. How do I talk to this person? What is okay to talk about? Should I feel comfortable if I want to talk to a person of color about being a person of color? Once you start going down that road, it just opens a whole new world. And then you add sexual orientation, and you add religion, and all these other doors that you get blocked off to when you're bigoted. You start opening them up, and it's just an incredible explosion of possibilities. And that became very exciting to me as a young person. Of all that stuff, you know, the people that my friend who is a avowed white supremacist, couldn't eat certain types of food, couldn't listen to certain types of music, couldn't hang out in certain parts of town. I can go anywhere. I prefer that. Klan rallies may be awesome if you're into burning things and talking about how awesome the supposed white race is, but I'd rather, you know, hang out with my friends of color and dance in gay bars and you know, kind of be a part of all the world that's out there. So
what a marvelous sensitivity you have.
Well, thanks. You know, I get very passionate about it. This work is never old to me. I've been doing it for a long time, but I feel like I get a piece of the puzzle each time. I had lunch today with one of my friends who's a professor of Black Studies at Portland State, and she opened more doors to me about things that I don't think about because of my white privilege. And so it's always exciting to me, and one of the keys to it is to be willing to make mistakes and be willing to be wrong and be willing to admit that you're wrong or that you don't know everything. And I think that in our culture, everybody, it's like a man who doesn't want to ask directions about how to get somewhere. Right? I know how to get there. I know how it works. I don't know. Right. I know. I mean, we're trained to do that, right? Yeah. I will drive around and around and around. That's why God invented GPS, so I don't have to ask for directions. It just beams in. Yeah, so it's always new.
All right, let me go to my cheat sheet.
Okay.
Yeah. If I were to ask your best friend, who is Randy? What would your best friend say in a few words?
Oh, man. Wow, I didn't realize it was going to be this kind of show.
And you don't have to answer.
No, well,
I'm interested in who you are personally, because the subject you're choosing to talk about has to be some depth in you to have you approach that being a white boy from Georgia.
Well, there's a country song that says I'm a work in progress, and I think that's what they might say. Right? I mean, and that I'm willing to be honest about. I haven't figured it out. I'm still working on it. My students sort of watch me sort of learn as I'm teaching them many times. Sometimes it's a little embarrassing. So I think that I'm committed but flawed, certainly. And I embrace both the things that I'm committed to and my wonderful flaws.
You're delightful.
Ah, thank you.
And my compliments are measured. I don't go overboard.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. That means a lot.
Shall we continue?
Sure.
And when and where were you born? You already told me in Georgia.
I grew up in Georgia, but I actually was born in Cleveland, Ohio in February 1964 while the Beatles were invading America. And there was a large group of folks who were part of the industrial Northeast when the steel industry closed. My father worked in the steel industry in the early 70s when the steel industry kind of collapsed, moved to the South. So we were called the Damn Yankees. I learned a quick lesson when I was a kid.
One word, Damn Yankees.
Yeah, right. I thought the Civil War ended in 1865. Apparently not. It was still being waged. And so I became an adopted son of the South at the age of 8 years old, and spent the rest of my life there until I moved to Portland.
Okay.
Yeah.
I usually tell my guests when we start that I have a trick question, and I can ask you now or wait and surprise you with it.
Well, now I'm a little nervous.
But you're the first guest that I've had that I want to ask both trick questions to.
Okay.
The first one I asked you already. Yeah. Who is? And the next one is, why were you born?
Man, why was I born?
I'm a clinical psychologist, as you know.
Okay. Well, I would say there's two answers to that. One is I was born because something biological happened between my mom and dad that I don't really want to think about. But if there was like a purpose to this, I think we sort of add meaning to things.
That's the reason
as
I
we
asked
go
the question.
along, right?
Yeah, excuse me.
And I think this particular issue. I was just having this conversation that I don't think we talk enough about uncomfortable issues about power and oppression and fairness, especially around issues of race and gender and sexual orientation. And I feel like I'm a facilitator of that conversation.
Yes.
I want to do the research, and I want to come up with some of the, we never prove anything in science, but we come up with evidence. I want to come up with some of the evidence about what works and what doesn't. But I want to be able to create an environment where we can have these conversations about things that, sometimes it's easier to talk about the weather or talk about sports, to talk about religion or talk about sexual, those are topics we shy away from, and sometimes we do ourselves a disservice because there's a lot. I've had white students say in class, racism ended in the 60s. And my next response to that is, well, what day? Because there had to be a day when there was racism and there was a day when there wasn't racism, right? So we should be able to identify that day and at least have a stamp or a commemorative plate or a holiday, the day racism ended, and of course, so that, of course, they never can do that because it hasn't ended. It's just changed and evolved. So I can't give you a short answer, but the short answer is that I'm here to talk. Apparently, I'm here to talk a lot about this stuff.
Great answer.
That's my job. I was born to talk. We were saying when I was having lunch with my friend who's a professor, she said, I get paid to talk, and I get paid I will talk whether you pay me or whether you don't pay me. I'll be talking. I'm just practicing when you're not paying me for when you will pay me.
Okay, shall we continue?
Sure. Hey, it's your show.
Yeah. It's our show.
Okay.
And anything significant about your cultural or national heritage, we know. I'm not sure there's an answer from you on that. Anything significant about your cultural heritage?
You know, like a lot of white people, I'm a mutt. You know, I don't have a distinct ethnicity. A lot of us have our ethnicity defined by our father's name. You know, my name is Blazak. It's a Czech name. My great-grandfather came over from what is now the Czech Republic. But you know, we lose this sense of ethnicity, and this is actually an area that I've done some research on and had a book chapter out about a few years ago. That there are a lot of young white people, you know, the Generation Y, the people that were born after 1980, essentially, who grew up without overt images of racism. I mean, I'm at least old enough to remember busing when I was a little kid. And there's what I call ethnic envy among many young white people because they see minorities who are allowed to celebrate their culture, you know, whether it's Black History Month or Chicano Pride or whatever it is. And if they want to talk about their pride, all they have is their race. And then that starts to look like, you know, a Ku Klux Klansman talking about white pride, right? They don't have this ethnicity. So, I mean, that's something that I kind of identify with. I do envy the ability to have that sense of pride in your ethnic identity, Creole, right? An incredible culture there, and a lot of good food, I must add. Having spent a lot of time in Louisiana.
And poor boy sandwiches.
Oh, man. All right, I have to take a moment. Wow. Yeah. You just sent my cholesterol level through the roof, but you know, the whiteness, the lack of that identity. Ethnic identity leaves you only race, and then that's sort of problematic.
Well, you're plain old American white bread.
Sure, but that's also tied to right. And we know, you know, having eaten Wonder Bread as a child, we know that it's not necessarily the best place to get your carbohydrates. Yeah, so I think part of that is that feeling of not having something that minority populations have, even though you have the power, right? You're part of the oppressive power of the, you know, a white supremacist nation, but but on an individual level, you don't feel like you have that ethnic identity, and I think that's challenging for a lot of people.
Yeah. Do you have a partner, boyfriend, girlfriend,
no,
husband, wife?
Recently, I did. If she's watching, hi. Yeah, no. You know, I live in, God, sort of, you know, my world is very intense. I'll just say it like that. My world is very intense.
I'd never guess.
Yeah, so sometimes I'm lucky enough to have someone who will put up with me for a period of time.
And she's watching it, yeah. Any children or grandchildren? No, you're not that old yet. Yeah.
No, you know, it's weird because it's a weird topic. And I live in somewhat of a dangerous setting in the work that I do, too. So I've often thought about that. Not that you always sort of plan children, but what would it mean to bring children into a world where I do this kind of work, where sometimes I'm a target of folks who don't like the work that I do for obvious reasons. So that may be a factor. I think it's more that just nobody can get along with me for very long.
About a question about your political persuasion, is that appropriate?
Yeah, sure.
Are you left or right or falling off either
I would see
end
myself
or what?
as it's funny because I'll say this before I answer the question. When I was 16 in 1980, I thought Ronald Reagan was the coolest guy on earth. I thought he was going to come, he was going to solve the Iranian hostage situation, he was going to solve the Afghanistan situation, the other Afghanistan situation, and he was going to kick butt, and he was going to maybe drop some bombs on Russia, and everything would be peachy keen. And then a year later, he was probably my biggest enemy on earth, as I saw the reality of Reaganomics. And so, you know, as a child of the 80s, you know, I was sort of forged in recognizing the impact of power on society. As a 19-year-old, I worked as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for the nuclear freeze. This is 1983.
Good left credential.
Yeah, right. The freeze. And it was a real lesson on how politics work. Being a lobbyist, you're literally in the lobby of your elected representative, but IBM gets ahead of you, Israel gets ahead of you, you know, all these people who have the money get ahead of you because you're just there to talk about peace. So I think that, you know, that really sort of set me on a path of being critical of, you know, the political system, but having a naive faith that democratic social movements can really make change. Sometimes they make change in small ways, and sometimes they make big sweeping changes, but it's never a battle that's over, right? It's sort of a constant struggle, and I think we're seeing that with things like Wisconsin and the amount of money that's in politics right now. And so, you know, I sort of have to be somewhat careful in the classroom when I'm talking about politics, because I want people to develop their critical thinking skills, but I also want them to develop their own way of thinking about it and not just adopt mine. Sure. But I will use sort of some of my ideas as examples and say, you know, I want you to make up your own mind, but here's something you might want to look at. Let's look at who's behind this bill. So, for example, we talk a lot about Measure 11, which is the mandatory minimum sentencing law in Oregon, and how that law was passed. There was a lot of money from, for example, private corrections companies.
Yes.
So, you know, we say, here's an example of where you might want to dig a little bit deeper. And I'm not saying you'll come to the same political place that I'm at, where you'll have exactly the same views, because my views are changing as well. But I just want you to think about power more critically. Mm-hmm. See, I can't give you a short answer on any of these questions. You ask these big questions, so I feel the need to expound upon them.
And I love it.
Great.
How about memberships in political, social, similar organizations that would be of interest to our viewers?
Well, I'm an officer in my union.
Union?
Yes, I'm a union man.
So am I.
American Association of University Professors.
Wonderful.
And we are doing we do a lot of outreach with neighboring unions like SEIU and AFT. And I think unions are very important because the middle class has been eroded. Wages have dropped in relation to inflation. We're seeing it in higher ed. We're seeing you know, the erosion of sort of the safety of tenure, but also just the salaries being dropped. And you know, there's more courses online, for example. I mean, this is one of the things that we're dealing with. Why do you need a tenured professor when you just put the courses online and have robots
and no
teach
human
them?
interaction or contact.
Yeah. So so the union. You know, there's a lot of people that are critical of unions. But the unions also provide a sort of defense mechanism against just the gutting of the middle class. So
then again, the question is which unions? The unions of the UAW and the steel unions and Walter Reuther, or the unions today that are in bed with the corporations?
Sure, yeah, and it's right. And it's always complex. It's never simple, right? It's never simple.
I've got one more question for you before we take a break, before my director yells at me. Any persons from the past or alive today that you particularly looked up to or admire? Any names come to mind right now?
Well, I was lucky to grow up next to Atlanta and be in Atlanta, so the first thing that pops in my head is Dr. King and the notion of nonviolence as a strategy. And there was you know, there have been times in my life where I've been fortunate enough to have his tomb in my neighborhood, and I would sort of ride my bike to his tomb and just sort of sit in front of it. So certainly that's a big one. And there's another person who many folks don't know, but a lot of people in my field do. Her name is Bell Hooks. She's a feminist writer, a black feminist who talks about the love ethic, kind of takes Dr. King's ideas and puts it into a sort of a sociological framework to understand how the world works. And I can't read enough of her stuff. She's sort of a constant touchstone for me. So those two folks, and the Beatles. They're the ones that got me started on this path, so I don't want to leave them out.
True Renaissance man of the 21st century.
A little bit of everything.
Can we take a break in there, please? back. Thanks for staying tuned. Now, for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and about whatever else that we decided to talk about. Tonight we're talking about the state of hate in the U.S. today. And the second half of the show, we're going to talk more about that. And I got through my introductory speech this time without bumbling like the first time.
Nice job.
So, will you lead off?
Yes.
The state of hate in the U.S. today. What does that mean?
Well, hate is a constant issue, and there are different types of hate. I still hate Brussels sprouts. But when we're talking about this type of hate, we're talking about sort of bias-motivated criminality and activity. So organized hate groups and hate crimes, and where we are in the current year as compared to the past, and what are we doing to kind of make things less hateful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The Southern Poverty Law Center comes to mind.
Sure.
You familiar with them?
Sure. I've done a lot of work with them over the years.
I should have known.
Yes.
Morris Dees, you ever meet him?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I have.
Wow,
in fact, I've done some there in Alabama. So and they try to keep track of the state of hate around the country, and so they have a big presence in the South, but not as much in the Northwest. So I kind of serve as one of their contacts in the Northwest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've done some work together.
monthly to their activities. Yeah.
Right.
So, what is the state of hate in the U.S.?
Well, we can measure it in different ways. I mean, one of the ways we can measure it is in the amount of hate crimes that are reported. And that's a sort of a controversial thing because it varies from state to state. Hate crime laws mainly exist on the state level, and some states like Wyoming don't even have hate crime laws. Oregon has one of the first hate crime laws. And so we can look at the amount of crimes that are reported. It's a crime sort of like rape that's very underreported.
Yes,
certain populations, often are afraid to call the police. I mean, the town that I grew up in, although it's changed very much in the last 30-something years, it was sort of well known that many of the police officers were in the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
So you wouldn't call the Klan if somebody was burning a cross in front of your house because they were already there. The police and the Klan were sort of one and the same.
Yeah.
That fortunately, Stone Mountain has changed, and they have a black mayor, and it's not a hotbed of Klan activity anymore.
A black mayor. No.
Yeah, who lives in the old Grand Dragon's house.
Oh.
Isn't that an amazing story? And one of the first things he did when he became mayor is he put a big bell in the town square to sort of fulfill Dr. King's prophecy of let freedom ring from the hills and the molehills of Mississippi and from Stone Mountain in Georgia. So there's this freedom bell there. It's just really great. But the reality is that people in various places, including immigrants and gays and lesbians, are often afraid of the police and don't report it. And so those numbers are we always have to put a big asterisk by them. We get about 8,000 hate crimes reported each year, which is a small amount compared to things like domestic violence or petty larceny. But it's believed that number is probably about 15 times higher. And so we can look at the state of hate based on that. We can also look at the state of hate based on the activism of hate groups. The Klan actually has had an upswing over the last 10 years or so, largely around the issue of illegal immigration from Latin American countries. And then the Obama election gave them a big boost.
Whoa.
Yeah, so we saw, especially in the South, a kind of revival of those groups. But the other thing I have to say is, and sometimes that's problematic. So for example, you mentioned the Southern Poverty Law Center. They count 15 hate groups in Oregon.
Yeah.
Some of those groups are really small. It could be 2 or 3 people.
Yeah.
Some of them they don't see because they're not a named group and are kind of off the radar. But they also include, those 15 groups in Oregon also include 2 black nationalist groups, one in Portland and one in Beaverton. Mm-hmm. So, but that's sometimes problematic too, because how big are these groups and how active they are. So it's coming up with an answer for what is the state of hate is sometimes problematic. And it also, the other part of this, just to make it even more complex, is we have traditional notions of hate like the Ku Klux Klan and hate crimes. But then we have the hate rhetoric that kind of bleeds into the mainstream. So whether we're talking about Rush Limbaugh and kind of the stuff that goes on talk radio, the Islamophobic Mike Savage, who just sort of spouts this out in the mainstream on a daily basis, or the Tea Party movement, or even on the other side of the political spectrum, you may get some of these folks who confuse the campaign for Palestinian statehood with anti-Semitism. Those are two separate things, anti-Zionism, but sometimes there's an overlap between those two, and there's a danger of anti-Semitism on the left side of the spectrum as well. So it gets very complex very quick when we talk about the state of hate.
Yes, yes.
That's my relatively short answer to that complex question.
Uh-huh. And what are you working on now?
Well, one of the things that has made this even more complex is the growing presence of these groups in the correctional facilities in America. We have a exploding prison population, especially after Reagan's war on drugs, that dumped a lot of folks into prisons. And a lot of those folks, especially in places like Oregon, where you have one strike and you're out, or first-time offenders, and we have minority gangs, and those are sort of gang members who are gang members on the street, and then they take their gangs with them in prisons. But then we have white gangs that kind of start inside the prisons. The Aryan Brotherhood is the most famous one, but here in Oregon, the big one is called European Kindred. So for the last few years, I've been sort of looking at the growth of this issue in the prisons, doing work in prisons in Oregon and Washington and Texas, where it's a particular problem, and then trying to find out what to do once those folks are released back into the community. 95% of people who go to prison are released back into the community. And there was a bumper sticker that I saw one day when I was out at Donnelly Long Juvenile Correctional Facility that really made an impact on me. I like it simple. If you can put it on a bumper sticker, something that can stick in my head. And this bumper sticker just said, "Today's prisoner is tomorrow's neighbor." And I thought that was so profound, because we love to throw away the key, right? Let's lock them up and throw away the key and think the problem is solved. But probably in about 3 years, those folks are going to be back into the community. Are they going to come into the community reformed or worse off than they went in? And with regards to the white supremacist gangs, I mean, sometimes these white offenders go in and they get indoctrinated into these groups, and they come out more hardcore committed hate offenders than they went in. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Why is there such an increase in incarceration in our country today?
Yeah, well, that's another big question. I mean, part of it is an extension of the way we control people. At the end of slavery, the prison population went up because the people came off the plantation, and then we just sort of locked them back up again. And it's a way of neutralizing populations. I think we saw this in Florida in the year 2000, where the more people you can say have a felony conviction, the more people you can take off the voter rolls. I mean, I think that's part of it. The big issue is the war on drugs. The war on drugs quadrupled the prison population in this country in a 4-year period in the 1980s.
Was that a war on drugs? What was the real reason? Is that a misnomer?
Yeah,
I
think so. I mean, I think that's
what should it be accurately named?
Yeah, well, I think it was mainly a war on brown people. I mean, if you really look at, I was in college in the 1980s, and I know on Front Row there was enough cocaine there to do anything that you wanted to, but there was never a drug raid on Fraternity Row at my university. Yeah. It was just sort of a green light for drug sales. But a half a mile away in the housing projects in Atlanta, the Red Dog Police Squad was, throwing people to the ground every day and busting them for a little bit of weed in their pockets. So when you see it like that, it's sort of clear what the story is, that there's a two-tiered problem, a way of dealing with drugs. Rich kids go into treatment and poor kids go into incarceration and then start that cycle, right? Then they're out of the family, they're out of the economic stream, and it creates all the cycles that go on with that, because they're going to be back in, right? A third of people are back in prison after 2 years of release. So it just creates this cycle. And so, I mean, this is a little bit about my politics here, but the mass incarceration, 2.3 million Americans locked up right now, another 6 million in some type of supervision, parole, and probation, has only hurt us as a nation. It's only neutralized and taken fathers out of families and taking creative people who could be coming up with new businesses and things like that out of the economy. And it's a wonderful form of social control.
So effectively, we've eliminated a substantial percentage of the voting population,
Sure.
such that they are not really citizens, since they can't vote.
Right, it's been
And
referred
they
to as the new Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think about hate. We've been talking about overt hate or evidence of hate by these organizations who track, like Southern Poverty Law Center, hate groups. But then, if the people in power, the authorities, arrange the system such that we can incarcerate brown and black people, are those people in charge hating, even though it isn't overt,
Right.
like the Ku Klux Klan? Or the
Sure.
White
Well, it's
Citizens Council?
institutional. You know, it's institutional. We forget that in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was widely, populated by mainstream people, including the governor of Oregon and the mayor of Portland, and supposedly President Harding was a member. And Oregon had the largest Klan population per capita in the country in the 1920s.
Unreal.
Yeah, and so that was mainstream, and now we sort of marginalize those people and kind of make fun of them, but that ideology is still within the system, and it's hard to change. We've come a long way, baby, but it's still a core part of the way we do business in this country. So we can focus on the kind of extremists, and this is one of the things I try to do when I talk into the community or I talk to students about these groups. We can talk about these guys with swastikas tattooed on their neck, and they embody everything that we think of when we think of hate. But we have to also look at it in the system, and then the hardest part is to look at it in us, right? Where we have these biases. You can have someone who is very anti-racism, but they can be incredibly sexist or homophobic, and even towards their own kind. So it's a spectrum, right? It's a spectrum between a neo-Nazi skinhead out there who's burning crosses and beating people up, then us, hopefully, on the other end, that are trying to do good things, but need to recognize the biases in ourselves. And then between those two extremes is the system that we live in, that we bring all that negativity and oppression to. And so that makes it really hard to undo, because you can say, I'm going to march in the streets and wave my rainbow flag, but you've got a system that has been built by this common element of oppression. And you don't change that overnight.
What's behind that? This system, the oppression. Is there something wrong or something amiss in the American experiment, where we have this substantial percentage of our population who behave as though people who are not white,
right,
or less than they are, or even worse?
Well, some of it may be rooted in our colonial past, right? We came here and discovered people who were already here. So there is that hierarchy that we've created, that notion of there's some type of ranking system of people. My students think it's funny when I tell them that 100 years ago, Irish people weren't considered to be white people. They were a separate race. Or that people who are left-handed were considered to be of the devil. That was less than 100 years ago, by the way, as someone who briefly went to parochial school found out.
Right. Were you Catholic?
No, but I did a little stint. When it's and here's the subtle racism. When busing started in the South in the early 70s, my parents, who would never say they were racist, pulled me out of public school and started putting me in private schools. So I picked up a message there that, there are black kids coming to this school. That's a bad thing. We're going to put you in the religious schools where you'll be safer. And so that was stuff I picked up on as a kid. But I definitely learned my Bible, which came in much value later, especially when I'm studying groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and a lot of these groups that use religion and their reading of the Bible, the Westboro Baptist Church and groups like that. So I'm glad that I can cite chapter and verse right back to them. So I did get something out of that, as well as fear of nuns.
Okay. What's going to happen to America in this competition struggle between classes, and maybe I'm going too broad here, and what's going on with the brown people in the Middle East? I heard someone talk about there is this constant struggle, not just between the classes, but also against races. like the American empire is interested in being sure that they control and use people of color, black, brown, or other than white, around the globe. You have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I do. There is a, so, you know, as a sociologist, we're always trying to sort of settle things in theoretical understandings of the world, and so, you know, there's certain paradigms that we can plug into, and so one of them is called world systems theory that looks at the global economy. It sort of takes Karl Marx and puts it on a global level. So instead of a national economy, we're looking at a global economy. And, you know, there are different countries that are the top of the ladder. So Spain during the reign of the Spanish Armada, or British during the British Empire, and then we had the American century, but we know that nobody's on top forever. And the global economy, sort of like a national economy, goes up and goes down, and usually it's on average of these 30-year waves. So the Depression was a global down wave, and then, you know, the 60s when we went on upwave, and we're on a global down wave now. And what we know is that when the global economy starts coming back together, there's always a chance it's going to be a new king of the hill, that there's going to be a shift of global powers. And there is a great theorist named Emanuel Wallerstein who's made the argument that the American century has sort of ended, and the Iraq War is evidence of that, that if we were the global power, we would just tell Iraq, you know, don't do it or else, but we couldn't. We had to go to war. And so there's an idea here that when the global economy comes out of the slump that it's in, there'll be a new king of the hill, and that's going to be China. So that means that we are in our last days as an economic powerhouse, and so we're fighting every way we can to make sure we get our culture out there. So if we can't do it militarily, we'll do it by getting our TV shows out, or getting Starbucks, or kind of, you know, the elements of American culture that we can sink in as a last-ditch effort to get everybody kind of into the American family, to hope that they'll want to be like us. But in fact, what that process is doing is creating more of a global divide between the global north and the global south. And so the odds are, you know, 50 years from now, things will flip, and everybody is going to be learning Mandarin Chinese to be a part of the global market. So I think we're in that moment, and we could go either way. It's exciting. It's exciting because I think that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we're going to be looking at this early 20th century as a time of incredible economic shift. But I think, you know, this is a time when that notion of Americanism doesn't have the same power that it had in 1946.
Why is that?
Well, we just don't carry the same moral authority that we had. You know, we have sold our souls to the company store. And, you know, the companies that were associated with America, like Ford, and, you know, the things that made America strong, are now part of the global marketplace and have their headquarters in Dubai, and are not invested in the idea of making America strong because they can get cheaper labor somewhere else. So the things that sort of backed us in our rise to global power have now kind of abandoned us for the global marketplace.
Has the Arab Spring be sort of the beginning of the demise of the American empire?
I think it started before that. I mean, I think it really started before that, but it's evidence of the shift to the other hemisphere. You know, we're going to be looking more towards the south of the equator for not only political models, but sort of cultural models and how to create social change. And so I think it's part of this larger shift away from, you know, I draw this picture of the world on the chalkboard in my class when I'm talking about the African diaspora and slavery, where I draw South America and Africa on the top and North America and Eurasia on the bottom, and the students look at it and they don't know what I'm drawing. And I'm like, here's Italy, right? Here's Florida. Those are always the easy ones to draw, right?
Sure.
And I said, why do you think that we always have the white countries on top? You know, and we have to have a conversation about, you know, for the last 200 years, the white countries have been, you know, the countries, the northern hemisphere countries have sort of driven the show, but it's not always going to be like that. And it always causes them to think a little bit about it. Yeah, so.
I wonder.
Yeah, this is a big topic, so I can't prophesize, but I would love to look back at this. You know, I always try to tell my students, you're living in history, right? You can talk about the 1960s if you want, but that's happening right now, and somebody's going to be studying you 30 years from now. And so it's your job to figure out what role you want to play in that moment in history. So I would love, hopefully, to look back in the future on this period and see how things turned out.
It's the first time you said something where I can offer a bit of a challenge, so to speak, for
Okay.
want of a better word. As you talk about the American empire and things changing on a global level, you're speculating about a north-south divide, and perhaps the southern hemisphere would be an ascendance. I don't see that happening. I think it's still going to be in the northern hemisphere with China.
Right.
I don't see the southern hemisphere with those poor black and brown countries. Of course, if I can hope wildly, perhaps the Bolivarian Revolution in Latin America and Fidel and Hugo and all of those guys. I'm just dreaming now.
Well, I mean, South America is in the ascendancy. I mean, it's the one that's really rivaling the kind of social mobility that China's had. So, I mean, I think in general, it's just, I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right. It's sort of a movement away from North America and Europe and to the, it depends on your perspective, right, to the left and down. Depends on how you position your globe. But sort of, you know, we're gonna see new global powers.
That's interesting how you talked about reversing the South and putting it on top, huh?
Well, you know, I was one of those kids from the Apollo generation, right? I mean, I grew up, I was 5 years old when we landed on the moon, and I remember seeing those first pictures of Earth from space and being confused. And I thought, where's Georgia? Georgia's the pink state. You know, where are the lines? Right, because I'm used to the map and the globe, and you know, Florida is always pointing downward, so it was always very easy to find. And I looked at the picture of the Earth, and I remember thinking, what is that? Where is everything? And then, of course, later I realized that those are all man-made lines, and not only the lines are man-made, but the positioning of the Earth is man-made.
Do you see hope diminishing in our country and diminishing overall the kinds of hate we've been talking about? You see it diminishing in the next 20 years.
The good news is, you know, I would like to offer some good news to the viewers of the world.
Yes, please.
The good news is the measure on getting back to the issue of hate. These measures, when we survey people, especially when we survey young people, we find less and less bias. We find kids more likely to have friends of different races. I mean, it's really clear the polls on same-sex marriage, the polls have flipped. More Americans are now in favor of same-sex marriage.
Yes.
People are more likely to know people of different religious backgrounds. You know, I grew up in a very homogeneous environment. People used to say, we couldn't be racist, there was only white people. Like, you know, we would be racist if there was somebody to be racist to. And so people live in much more diverse environments that erodes a lot of that ignorance that people have. I mean, we're all ignorant, right? You can't blame someone for being ignorant. There's a lot of things. I don't know how to speak Zulu, right? I'm ignorant of that. It doesn't make me a bad person. It just means it's something I haven't learned yet. And so it's harder and harder to be ignorant of these things the more our population changes. You know, you're going to get the people who react against that. I mean, these are the extremists that I spend my time studying. But for the most part, people are just groovier than they were 30 years ago. I mean, they're just sort of more kind of cool with diversity and, you know, all this stuff about how the white piece of the pie is now going to be less than the non-white piece of the pie by 2050, according to the U.S. Census. The white supremacists love to go crazy over that. Most people are fine. You know, we're a nation of immigrants, right? We're always going to be coming from somewhere. You know, it's a bad sign when there's more people leaving than coming. That's when you need to worry. That's when you need to start learning how to speak Mandarin Chinese. It's a good sign that people want to move here, right? That means we're still a place where people see their dreams coming true and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, I think in general it's good. It's good. And the crime rate has been dropping steadily since 1992. The hate crime rate has been relatively stable, but I think that's because we're just sort of figuring out how to get more people to report it. So I think it may be dropping with the regular crime rate. There's just more people reporting it. So I feel a lot of excitement about those issues. The thing that causes me pause is the fact that that's happening while the middle class is disappearing, and we're getting more a division between the wealthy and the not wealthy, and so that's the challenge, right? That's the huge challenge.
You have been a delightful guest. You really have.
I'm highly caffeinated. I made sure I had a little coffee before I came into your studio tonight.
So it's close to time for us to stop. So keep your pens and pencils handy out there, because you'll be able to jot down something that we will show you in the closing credits. Thanks again for watching, and I invite you to give us feedback. Uh-oh, I have been notified that it's time to close. I have a few public service announcements. That's the first one. To get the Dr. Don local broadcast schedule, go to www.donbaham.com, my website, and click on Present Day Activities. And another public service announcement that I like to put on regularly because they're important to me. To watch Dr. Don shows on the web 24/7, go to my website again and click on Favorite Links. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, that's a great organization. Been a member for 3,000 years, or something like that, an awful long time. The American Civil Liberties Union, they're protecting our civil liberties. They're diminishing with this present administration and the direction our country is going, so get a hold of the ACLU. Next we have, to get my shows broadcast by other stations around the country, ask your local public access station to go to www.pegmedia.org. And last but not least, end corporate personhood now. Go to www.movetoamend.org so we can amend the Constitution to say that corporations are not persons, and we can turn our country back over to the citizenry. All right. Oh, I got to thank you one more time. Thanks for watching this show. And remember, KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken, not that KFC, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable. To you too. And you too. And you too. And you too. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure.